Welcome to our panel here about authoritarian policy and populist movements in Eastern Europe. Am Anfang werde ich unsere Teilnehmer auf Deutsch vorstellen, aber dann werden wir zum Englischen übergehen. Wir haben heute Nachmittag hier als Teilnehmer Irina Rastorgujeva. Sie hat Philologie studiert an der Staatlichen Universität in Sachalin. Sie ist auch Journalistin. Sie war Dramaturgin am Tschechow-Theater in Sachalin und schreibt unter anderem für die Berliner Zeitung, für die FAZ und für die Zeitschrift Osteuropa. Und sie hat das Buch Das Russland Simulacrum veröffentlicht, das durchaus weithin rezensiert und wahrgenommen worden ist. Danach ist Russland ein Land ohne Inhalt, alles ist Lüge, alles ist absurd. Unser nächster Teilnehmer ist Grigori Judin. Er ist Politikwissenschaftler und Soziologe, ein Experte zu öffentlichen Meinungen und zu Meinungsumfragen in Russland. Er war bis Anfang des Jahres an der Higher School of Economics in Moskau. Kurz vor dem Krieg hat er vor dem Kriegsbeginn gewarnt und wurde dann nach dem Kriegsbeginn von der Polizei wegen Teilnahme an einem öffentlichen Protest zusammengeschlagen und musste dann medizinisch behandelt werden, ist jetzt an der Princeton-Universität in den USA. Und der dritte im Bunde ist Ulrich Schmidt. Er hat Slawistik studiert, Germanistik, Politologie, und ist Professor für Kultur und Gesellschaft Russlands an der Universität in St. Gallen, außerdem noch Prorektor an derselben Universität und hat sich sehr breit mit russischer, ukrainischer, polnischer Literatur, mit Philosophie und Kultur befasst. Und insbesondere der dritte im Bunde ist Ulrich Schmidt. Es gibt ein Echo hier. Und er hat insbesondere bei Surkamp ein Buch vor Jahren veröffentlicht, das weithin Aufmerksamkeit erregt hat, nämlich zur Technologie der Seele. Ich selbst bin Andreas Heinemann-Grüder. Ich unterrichte Politikwissenschaft hier an der Universität Bonn und bin auch an diesem Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies und befasse mich da auch mit Osteuropa, insbesondere mit dem Ukraine-Konflikt. But now let's switch to English. One of the questions we like to discuss here today in the afternoon is what is actually specific Eastern European about these populist movements? Is autocracy actually popular, or is it just a way of legitimizing autocracy? And let's start with Irina. In your book, you basically portray Russia as being a country of nihilism, cynicism, of absurd performances, simulating politics, but that would somehow be in contradiction to the idea that there is popular support. So if this is all about nihilism, then people would not support Putinism. They would simply live in a separate mental world.
This is a very interesting and it's such a complicated question to answer in this in few words. It's not so easy. I think that this is not popularity. This somehow fatalism. Yeah, this is a fatalistic, such a fatalistic behavior or learned. An ability to do something, yeah, and also tightness of society. We mustn't remember that 30 years ago, this Soviet state was over, yeah, only 30 years ago, and then started heavy in 90s, where people just try to survive. After 90s, there was the first meeting with this consumer society, yeah, when people firstly had the possibility to buy something, finally to choose, I don't know, maybe not president, but a sausage in a shop, yeah, and this was also very important. And it's not so easy now to refuse from this. It was such a long way to have something finally for themselves, yeah, and therefore I think that it's about popularity. This is such a this is not a majority who really supporting Putin's idea. Majorities wants to be left alone. They doesn't want to be bothered. They just already tired to fight, and they don't want to take any responsibility. And therefore, in this case, populistic ideas are very. Populistic ideas found this fertile soil, for developing. I think that there's only partly explaining, what is going on, but somehow.
Okay, but that would end up to, public preferences that are basically informed by material benefits. So you go shopping, and as long as you can go shopping and can do some vacation, you are fine, but you are apolitical. So is this whole talk about, freedom, rule of law, freedom of choice, was this from the very beginning just an affair for a tiny part of the intellectual elite, so that actually what Westerners talk about, Western values, that this was actually never a dominant preference?
This is also very interesting phenomenon. We can saw that actually Russian society was always so indifferent, and so somehow not interested in this Western freedoms. But 20 years already continuing these protest movements, 20 years without results. This is also, people have to leave the country during these 20 years. And they are also without seeing any result, only repressions, only punishments. And after this, of course, it's very difficult to continue to take part in these activities. In the same moment, the state making all possible to exclude people from active political life, and in all levels, actually, all institutions are not working, and this all social institutions, they are not working. All so-called NGOs, they are also excluded now from this political life. All is not active, and there are no instruments to fight. And in this case, also, this is a big question, how to stay active and how to fight for these fantastic liberal values. What is this instruments? Where to take them from?
A question to Grigory. In the early 1990s, I recall there was always, talk about the different strands in the public discourse in Russia. So we had the Westerners, the Atlanticists, we had the Slavophiles, we had the Russian nationalists, we had the Eurasianists, we had the statists or etatists. And in the end, one gets the impression of all these different strands, that there was a contraction, that actually of all the choices that were somehow open and it was still not decided where Russia's public opinion would go, that in the end, only the etatists survive. And is this cult of a strong state the only remaining source of legitimacy?
Well, I think actually the neoliberals won. The neoliberals won with their dream of having a Russian Pinochet that they're supposed from the late 80s. And well, they succeeded after all. And this is how we got to this hyperbolization of state, with Russia remaining an essentially neoliberal country.
Would you say that actually we have no East-West divide, but we have a divide between, those being pro-Putin, let's say, government Russia, and the rest? So that the divide is no longer East-West, it's rather how do you relate to Putin's Russia? And this is the defining marker. So inside Russia, but also outside Russia, so that the East is no longer the East, but it is more important, how do you relate to Putin's regime, to Putin's war, to the preferences, let's say, of the Siloviki, so the Silo-archic regime in Russia?
I would say that actually the very division between the East and the West is, or rather was, in many respects, artificial until this war started, because actually you could find much more difference between the Western countries than between them and Russia. Now, of course, I mean, Putin's nightmares, they all come true. And now he indeed has a united West standing against him, precisely because he created it. Instead of exploiting the divides within the West, he created this united West. And now we have this, I mean, we have to admit that we have this resuscitation of the West. But the East, I don't really know what the East means in this situation, and I don't even think that the idea of the East has gotten any hold in Russia. So I would be very cautious about those oppositions.
Let's now turn to Ulrich Schmidt. You have written about different, geographical areas of political culture. Most of the countries in the East, former socialist countries, want to be part of the West. And maybe in their preference for democracy and their rejection of autocracy, they are often more Western than even some Western countries. So is there actually a cultural underpinning still at work for an East-West divide, or is it in the end only about politics? So would you say there are still determinants or legacies of the past where you would say they are particularly Eastern, or would you say, no, this is all about politics, about expectations, preferences, but not determined by the past?
Well, as a professor of cultural studies, I have, of course, to stress the importance of culture. And this is not only a rhetorical device that I'm using here, but I think it's definitely the case that in most countries that we call today the countries of East Central Europe, culture is key and decisive, and their describing narrative, basically, after 1990, after the demise of communism, basically point to a return to Europe, where they belong. And if you go back to Winston Churchill's famous speech in Fulton in the US, where he really lamented that all those capitals like Prague, Warsaw, Sofia, and so on now are behind an iron curtain and not accessible anymore, and not part anymore of this common European culture, then, of course, this is extremely important for the countries in East Central Europe. Now, when it comes to Russia, of course, there are several narratives that kick in. So there is a very prominent European narrative in Europe that was also very intensively used, let's say, by Boris Yeltsin, who famously even applied for NATO membership for Russia and wanted basically to continue also this narrative of the common European house, which, by the way, was not initiated by Gorbachev, but even by Brezhnev, who first used this phrase in a visit in Bonn, in Germany. So I think with Eastern Europe, and here I agree with Greg, I think this is a very complicated question. And if we look at statements from people, from East Central Europe and Eastern Europe, they always say, well, we're Europe and the East begins behind me. or east of me.
On the other hand, we hear also voices from Eastern Europe who claim we are the real Europeans, and the Western Europeans, they have sold out their soul to Islam, to immigrants, to an ever more individualized gender identity, which somehow trumps all other identities. So we voted for a Europe, and we are somehow defending the image of Europe, what Europe stood for, but Europe is moving into a direction that is basically a departure from what we originally wanted to return to.
Yes, by all means. And I think here Zelensky's speech at the European Parliament is also quite indicative, because Zelensky famously said, we are defending here in Ukraine European values. And actually, when you listen carefully to Zelensky, he doesn't say Ukraine wants to join Europe. But basically, his wording is the other way around. Europe has to go back to its roots and basically join the European convictions that are being upheld by the Ukrainian government, by the Ukrainian people under the Russian aggression. And I think similar convictions are also present in East Central Europe. I just wanted to remind you that the usual suspects, Poland and Hungary, within the European Union that are being accused of populism and authoritarianism, these were basically the first nations to fight against communism and against the oppression by the imperialist center in Soviet Moscow. Famously, Timothy Garton Ash pointed out that, well, the end of socialism took in Poland 10 years, in Hungary 10 months, in Germany 10 weeks, and in the Czech Republic 10 days. And here you can really see that Poland and Hungary were basically the spearhead of the liberal and democratic movement in the 80s.
But maybe as a follow-up, there is a misunderstanding, because we always identified anti-communism, anti-Bolshevism with liberalism. So we had a wide emigration in the 1920s in Berlin, Paris, and other European capitals. They were Eurasianists. They were often against liberalism. They were Eurasianists. We had the book Homo Sovieticus, and in the end, its author turned into a anti-liberal. We have Solzhenitsyn, who was critical of the Soviet system of Stalinism, but while he was in the United States, he became very anti-liberal, pro-Great Russia, Slavophile, against Atlanticism. So is this really this narrative? Does it hold water that we claim, Poland, Hungary, they were the forerunners of, getting rid of the socialist system, and we identify this with, being for democracy and liberal values? Maybe they were simply against the Soviet system, but this does not, imply that they were actually in favor of open societies, but maybe they were more in favor of traditional, in the case of Solzhenitsyn, maybe even Tsarist ideas of Russia.
Well, I think you raise a very important point, and I think this is probably also the end of the political categories of right and left in these post-socialist countries, because it's very difficult to define, for instance, the political identity of, let's say, President Alexander Kwasniewski, who was a sports minister in the last Polish communist government, and then turned out to be a very progressive president of Poland and Prime Minister of Poland, and he brought about a lot of liberal reforms that are basically responsible for the fact that Poland turned out to be one of the models of post-socialist transition.
Irina, I want to return to you. I have a question because you are also, in cultural studies and literature well versed. When I look, I mean, I'm not that professional as Ulrich. I'm not a professor of cultural studies and so on. I've read a couple of books, but my idea is that in Russia there were always different strands. Yeah, so we had Tolstoy, we had the pacifist strand, we had Nabokov, who was rather a liberal. We had, the Eurasianists, Berdyaev. We had, modernists and so on. In the end, out of this, complexity, heterogeneity of different intellectual strands, one gets the impression Dugin is the only survivor. How is that impression right? That among those different strands that formed a composite and that were always perceived also in the outside world, as forming a very diverse picture of Russia. When I first read Dugin 22 years ago, I felt, this is nuts. I'm not going to read more than a chapter because this is simply not to be taken seriously. And now I have to see this guy as a provider of templates, of speaking publicly, of rhetorics. When he talked about Satanism, I felt, maybe you have to go to the psychiatry. Now you have a president who wants to fight Satanism. How come? Can we explain this contraction?
This is very strange. When I'm reading these speeches of our governmental leaders, sometimes I'm thinking that I'm reading some postmodernistic novel because it's also mixed and also turned. And this is also interesting that in postmodernistic philosophy, that can be the end of the world, with a atom bomb. Just it can over like this, and I think that this is the most awful, maybe, that Putinismus. This is very strange but interesting word. That Putinismus is creating alternative reality, believing in this reality, and creating this as a collage from different, totally not fitting, contradictory narratives. Therefore, you always have this feeling that you are listening some speeches from psychiatrical clinic. Therefore, it's always a little bit, not a little bit, but disturbing. You can't find how this contradictional point of views can come together. And this all the time speech about traditional values. What is traditional values? No one explained this, but nevertheless, this is a fight for this. Therefore, and also Putinism is reproducing itself. And it seems that the whole country living in such crazy discourse. But it's not true. This is this reproduction system with propaganda, with mass media, with trolls, with great amount of people who are shouting very loud. We can hear only propagandists. We can't hear from Russian normal people. They are like not existing. Therefore, we have this feeling that all other directions, in philosophy or cultural literature, whatever, they just died. But it's also we can't judge this now because this Putinistic rhetoric covering all. It's like such a big cover. And when this will disappear, I hope. What we will find beneath, this is also very difficult to say. I think in Soviet Union, it was also this biggest idea that was covering all, yeah? And what was behind this idea, what was under this idea, what was in samizdat was difficult to understand, yeah, and to collect and to really to find these directions what were developing under this cover. Nowadays it's the same, it's biggest idea, totally destructive idea, but it's just now the main idea of a government, and they are nothing to hear and nothing to see as governmental propaganda. From Russia.
Andreas, can I just jump in?
Oh, yes, of course. I would have turned to you immediately. But
no, I mean,
okay.
I want just to push back a little bit against the assumption of the question, because I mean, would you say that Möller, Van den Broek, or Houston Stewart Chamberlain, they embody the German culture or the German thought? Did they emerge as the winners after all? Did it all boil down to those thinkers? I don't think so. I think in German culture and in German political thought, in German intellectual history, there are multiple currents. And that's also the case with Russia. Well, some of them would prevail at some point, and some of them would be destructive. Does that mean that they exhaust the whole heritage?
No. No, not at all. Not at all. Of course, it is part of the repertoire. It's part of the legacy. But the question is, why was it possible, even among common people, to suppress the other strengths, which were very present, I would say, in the late 1980s and the 1990s. So the question is, for me, I know Putin started as an anti-Yeltsin, yeah. Then he became a kind of James Bond, and then he became somehow a warrior for orthodoxy and the clash of civilizations. And now he is a real warrior. And do people follow this, dynamic, this, spillover from one dominant ideology to the next? Or is this just an elite thing? So how popular is this? I understand that Putin as Alta Yeltsin was popular. To some extent, Putin as James Bond was also popular because he somehow presented strength and so on. To maybe some extent, even, the clash with the West. But the return to traditional values, is this popular? Does anybody want to die in the war against gay Europa or against Satanism? Who is buying that? What is popular in this?
Well, that's a legitimate question, but I think Irina has a good answer to that. What you're mentioning now are not really most of that is not really ideological stuff, but mostly images to be sold to the public. Well, to a certain extent, he, of course, was anti-Yeltsin, but on many other accounts, he continued Yeltsin's legacy, and he borrowed from that. And look at the contemporary Russian oligarchy that became one of the richest in the world. Many of those people were standing next to, just beside Yeltsin in the 1990s. So I wouldn't confuse those public images with the ideology. And as for the ideology, I think Irina has a right answer. This is, to a large extent, a post-ideological situation, because those ideological tropes, they can be easily substituted for each other. And that was actually the strong side of this regime. It was happy to jump from socialist tropes to nationalist tropes to imperialist tropes to liberal tropes, and nobody really cared. Why? Because people are completely alienated from politics. So if you want to find an ideological core in this strange mix, I think there is a residual, actually, and this residual is, I mean, there is a deeply conservative ideology behind that, and this is a counter-revolutionary ideology, a strong belief in extreme animosity of the world, a strong ontological insecurity, the complete distrust not only in politics or in government, but complete distrust towards the people around you. Russia has one of the lowest levels of generalized trust in the world. So this is the ideology. Basically, the world is a bad place. I think Putin actually had a good summary for that last year when he met Joe Biden in Switzerland. He said, "Well, there is no happiness in the world. Why do you think that we are supposed to be happy to live a good life? No, that doesn't happen. The world is a bad place. People are supposed to suffer. People are supposed to kill each other. This is the ideological core, and that kind of explains you the attitude. Doesn't mean that people are really willing to go and fight this war. Well, part of them are. I would say this is still clearly a minority, but that makes people completely resentful, alienated from politics, frustrated, and actually filled with bad blood. This is true. That doesn't necessarily transfer into a willingness to fight. And once again, this is not something to be observed among the majority of the Russians, but it creates a toxic atmosphere, definitely.
I mean, one could say, okay, even the Soviet Union was a post-ideological state. I mean, they so often changed their ideology and made switches from one direction into the next, and they were very opportunistic, very flexible about what has to be believed in, apart from very general idea. So, but what I'm asking myself is, even if ideology is not the key, maybe the modus operandi internalized in Soviet times is still functional, because people knew how to behave under situations of this opportunism, of this cynicism, of this disrespect for human life, in situations of fear, of repression, of distrust, of atomization. So many traits of the everyday experiences from the Soviet times are maybe still there. So it's not the ideology, it's a behavioral pattern. So it's the way you assimilate, you adjust. So that in that sense, one could say maybe the Homo Sovieticus is still there. In terms of behavioral patterns, far less in terms of persuasion, conviction, in terms of worldviews. Would you share that view?
Well, Homo Sovieticus is a racist ideological trope coined by
Levada.
Well, you
Others
mentioned
too, yeah.
you mentioned Zinoviev. Zinoviev is a different story and much more complicated.
Yeah.
But late Soviet liberal intelligentsia, people like Levada, of course, they are deeply demophobic and they are using the racist language. So I wouldn't even consider it useful. But speaking of the Soviet legacy, generally, I would claim that it does more harm than good for us trying to understand what's going on in Russia now, because this is a very, very different society. I would disagree that Soviet Union was ideologically empty and void. Of course, in the late Soviet Union was to a large extent devoid of its initial ambitions, but still it was a society that believed in progress. It believed in science. It believed it believed in humanity becoming better. That was a deeply ingrained belief. Now we have a completely opposite situation. So instead of that like vague left-wing ideology, we have an extreme version of right-wing ideology. This is like right now. This is the fascist regime. And that stands in a clear opposition to the Soviet society. Now, as for your question, I think, well, for the older generations, that might be partly true. Some of the behavioral patterns, they do indeed reproduce. And I mean, a couple of days after the war started, we had a heated discussion with colleagues on how we should react to the war. And I was, of course, arguing for making a public statement. And somebody, a senior colleague told me, well, you don't understand that. We have to learn to be silent again. Because it was immediately her previous experience that came to her mind, and those behavioral patterns, they got activated. In that sense, I think you're right. So for the senior generations, some of those behavioral patterns they stick, but that is only as far as we can get with those parallels with the Soviet Union, because even atomization that we have now is of a very different nature from the Soviets.
May I jump in here and contradict you? I'm against the characterization of the current regime in Russia as fascist. You can say anything bad about the Putinist regime, but I don't think that fascism is an apt characterization for it. Why? Because I think fascism, of course, implies a mass mobilization. And Putinism in the last 20 years has been about depolitization of the whole society. And this makes for Putin also so difficult now to mobilize the population for this war. And this is why he hesitated so long with the mobilization for this war in Ukraine. And let me also add something towards the use of ideology. My impression is that the current leadership in the Kremlin somehow behaves like Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. So they basically, make seem that they believe in their imperialist visions, but in fact, they are not with Christ anymore, as Dostoevsky pointed out, but they are with the Antichrist. So they don't believe in the narratives, and this is also the explanation why they can so quickly and easily change those ideological narratives. Remember the Nazi narrative, which was very prominent after February 24th. It disappeared. Why? Because nobody bought it. And the only narrative that seems to work now within the broad Russian population is the anti-Western and especially the anti-NATO narrative. I think a majority of the Russian population really buys into this narrative that we are fighting for Russian values, for the Russian state, for the Russian nation against evil NATO.
Just a very short follow-up. I agree with you, Ulrich, on the fascist issue. I mean, I've made this point myself many times that the regime was built on demobilization. Of course, I said that this is a fascist regime, a political regime, but not a fascist society. And I think you are completely right to point out the difference between those two things, because this difference is now the problem for Vladimir Putin himself. But the political regime it became after February 24th. I think it's full fascist without being a fascist society at this point. So these are two different things to me. But otherwise, I agree with you completely.
But let me jump in here. I mean, if we go to Hannah Arendt, and then I will ask also Irina, but Hannah Arendt didn't talk about a fascist regime. She talked about the totalitarianism. And she said, basically it's turning civil society into masses, basically addressing people only as masses that follow leaders. So it's a mass society. It's no longer a society formed of, associations of people with individual interests who have to find compromises, but society is addressed as a mass. In that sense, Gregory, one could nonetheless say you have maybe not a mobilized, but you have a mass society. And in that sense, it would fit, the understanding of Hannah Arendt, who said, the masses are only followers of leaders, of charismatic leaders. the masses are no agents anymore. They have no agency of their own. They are mobilized and demobilized. But in the end, they are only treated as masses. And there are so-called mass crystals that may act in the name of the masses, like Lenin's, party as a forerunner of the working class. But basically, so in that sense, would you nonetheless say there is something that is similar to this understanding of mass society, even if you don't want to call it fascist, because it's disempowering the society to an extent where it is only functioning as a mass, but no longer as a society.
My take on that would be that what Arendt gives us is actually a warning that the mass society, the atomized society, is an ideal client for fascist mobilization. And that, I think, is also true of Russia. And we actually saw some elements of that in the early days of war, because there was some sort of fascization of society. It later receded, and that's why I agree with Ulrich at that point, that it's again a more of a demobilized situation. But look, when people are so atomized, when there is no trust, you can easily get scared. And people started doing terrible things, like denouncing each other out of fear. I mean, my own colleagues, out of sheer fear, started denouncing each other, not because they believe in, I don't know, in Nazis in Ukraine, but just because they got scared that if they don't denounce someone, they would be denounced themselves. So in that sense, I think this is a dangerous condition. I mean, this is definitely a society with a broken trust, which is highly atomized, and in that sense, it is susceptible to fascist, to an immediate fascist takeover. I don't know whether that will happen, but that's the
Irina, to what extent would you say, I mean, you have lived in the Far East, you grew up and spent time closer to America and to China than to Brussels and Berlin. Maybe mentally you were nonetheless closer to Brussels and Berlin than to Beijing. But to what extent do you think this idea of, we have to some extent take revenge for the West who didn't take us in? So they took in the Poles, they took in the Czechs, and we never ever had a chance. All the business came, they wanted to sell their products, maybe some people traveled to the West, but in the end, we never had a chance because we never were invited to become a member of the EU or of the NATO, or there was never talk about, Russia being an equal partner because it was too large. And to what extent do you think somehow the disappointment, there were others who were also growing up under socialism. They were taken in, they were welcome, returned to Europe, as Ulrich said, But there was never ever talk about a return to Europe when we spoke about Russia. Is there a sense of revenge, a disappointment? We were never ever invited. We never had a chance. So similar to Turkey.
But excuse me, in Sakhalin, Europe is so far away that it's like not existing anymore. And Moscow is also very far away. And it's just unreachable thing. And as a kid and also teenager, I never thought that I someday could see, not Europe, Moscow, or for example, St. Petersburg, or maybe Novosibirsk. That is not so far actually, if we think about this in the scale of the country, but nevertheless, relatively far away. And I think that people in Kamchatka and people in Chukotka and especially people from Kuril Islands, they have never thought about it. It was never a topic of everyday life. It was never a topic of discussions in the kitchen. There were some other questions, But so
the explanation of, frustration as a cause of, support for Putin's revenge doesn't hold water. So you would say no hopes, no frustration.
in this part of Russia, there was quite nothing. And also, I want to notice this. I want just to a little bit to return back to this people who are believing really in these narratives what produced by Putin's Russia. Yeah, it's actually very strange that such feeling appearing, that people really buying it. No, it's not true. The biggest narrative of this greatest win, of the greatest war, is not working itself too. Yeah, it's all a lie. It's all a game, and people are playing in this game. They're going to these portraits in this immortal battalion or whatever, and then they are throwing away these portraits. They are not caring about this. It's not a topic also, yeah, and they are not a topic to fight with Nazism, or there was never a topic to I mean, in Ukraine there was never a topic to take Kherson, whatever, what for actually. What for in 2021, if someone would ask people on the street in Russia, do you want to take Kherson? What for? What for we need this actually? Why? And all these narratives that this is like such a pop-up propaganda that's appearing, and then there were so many reasons already also for this war. We are making this war because of Nazis in Ukraine. Then we have to release Russian people in Donetsk. There were so many different reasons by beer laboratories, dangerous mosquitoes, and so on. It's just, you can become crazy if you believe in all this shit. Yeah, this is so much different, unreal. Who will believe in these military mosquitoes? Really, if they are, or in these military birds, yeah, but it was at the beginning of the war. I can't imagine. Maybe a few people who already had some difficulties with their psycho, they believed, yeah, but no, it's just a big game, yeah? And it seems so that people are playing in this game, maybe without pleasure, but they have no other choice.
I mean, I witnessed here in March and April these pro-Putinist autocorsos in Germany, and followed a bit also the Russian-speaking diaspora, and there was some popular support for Putin's war, flag waving, rallying around the flag, and so on. And I asked myself, what is the reason? And maybe the diaspora community is different from, the cynicism inside Russia. But I asked myself, is this related to this issue of recognition? So they didn't recognize us, and then, you get this backlash. And to what extent? I mean, you say in Sakhalin this was not the case. Maybe Gregor, you have a different opinion because you grew up in the European part of Russia, that you felt maybe nonetheless closer to Berlin and Brussels than to Sakhalin, and therefore this non-recognition, frustration, and backlash against that holds more water in the case of European Russians, or at least some elites. Would you say there is something to this argument we co-produced the Putinist mentality by non-recognition?
Well, I think I actually take the point. I think the recognition issue is a big one. It contributes a lot to this widespread feeling of resentment in Russia. But look, the deficit of recognition is not a Russian thing. I mean, we have a lot of people in Western Europe who complain about not being recognized. What I like to push back against is against exoticizing the issues that we do have in Russia. The vast majority of them are just exaggerated versions of the dysfunctions of current political regimes in many other places. You have a lot of trouble with recognition on both right and left in the United States, for instance, and therefore you have a lot of resentment. You also have that in Germany, definitely, to a lesser extent. But Russia, in this sense, is just a radical version of the same issues. So I wouldn't blame the imagined West for that. I would rather point to deeper structural problems that we're all facing now, and which are just more prominent in Russia. One small point that I would like to add to this is Well, I know there is this, this sense of disappointment about Russia. Well, guys, we tried so badly to integrate you, and now you're doing what? But this is not true. Look, 70% of Russians have never traveled abroad, and this is exactly what Irina was mentioning now. This is a country where vast majority has never ever been abroad, never ever tried a different life, never ever had experience of just having taken a look at this at a different life. Only 8% of Russians have traveled to Europe. 8%. Mm-hmm. So what kind of integration was that? I'll tell you what was the integration. The integration was with the big money, because Putin's cronies, Russian oligarchs, yeah, they indeed enjoyed. Not only did they enjoy the European life, they got well entrenched in this life. They managed to bribe, to corrupt the European elites, and to export Russian corruption there. So they were welcome. But integration of Russia, it never happened. And I think the German ruling coalition took a very good step, deciding to lift the visa requirement for the Russian young in late December. The only problem was that it was already too late.
Maybe in the US we have quite a similar situation. How many? The vast majority of Americans never traveled abroad. They don't own passports.
Right. But you have.
So I think
more heterogeneity. You have more diversity within the US, and that kind of helps. But otherwise, I agree.
Yes, and I think probably to come back to Andreas's point. Well, where does the Russian population stand? My guess is that at this point, the Russian population is like in the famous last line of Pushkin's drama Boris Godunov. They're just speechless in an active way. They're speechless. So they would have something to say, but then they don't utter their thoughts because I think we can describe Russia today as a state with an internal occupation. The Putin regime behaves like a foreign power occupying Russia. And I recently talked to a colleague from a Russian university. And then it occurred to me that maybe we should not look at the single individual. What does the single individual believe or think or utter? But what is the interaction in a given group? Because my colleague from a Russian university told me that now there is this speechless majority that did not emigrate, and then there is a small group of watchdogs that controls this speechless majority.
I mean, maybe we should pick this up here at this point, because it relates also to one question here raised in the chat about whether people actually believe in this, alternative reality produced by Putin. Are they believers, or do they simply acquiesce to official paradigm? So does this hold true, that we have a speechless society? I would say yes. There was maybe in the 1990s disorientation. One did not know where to go after the Soviet system was gone. And there was even a book published some 20 years ago about the post-Soviet aphasia in Russia. But on the other hand, I feel that many people who in the 1990s were disoriented now use slogans. So is this really true that, those people who show the signs Z, that they don't believe in it, that they are only paid for it, that they are all cynics, but the next day they would show the same sign, or do they nonetheless follow certain tropes, certain slogans, rhetorics, So do we really have to follow this, picture of a passive, demobilized niche society, which is not fascist, as Gregory said, but there is at least a part whom you can actively mobilize and who show up, demonstrate, and so on. So can we really follow this picture of, there's a speechless society? Some are at least showing. And those I'm speaking here in the diaspora too, there's very outspoken. Some of them are very, very outspoken.
No, but that's a different thing. This is what the diaspora is doing in Germany. It is completely impossible to do in Moscow. I mean, in Moscow, if you try to stage a demonstration for Putin, you will be in jail the next day. It's completely impossible. You risk your freedom if you start doing that. And some ultra militarists were trying to do that in the early days of the war. They immediately got the notification that this is a dangerous game. They are not supposed to do that. Until they are not summoned, they are not supposed to do that. So in that sense, the reaction of the Russian diaspora in Germany, I mean, that looks outlandish to the Russian way of life. So we indeed do have this passive majority. I mean, I agree here with both Irina and Ulrich. This is a deplorable situation, of course. I mean, this is a terrible disease. This depoliticization, estrangement, lack of political responsibility. But that's a different disease from what many people would assume from active aggression. Now, against this passive majority, you of course have a small but very vocal minority, which can be staged as the true people. So these people are aggressive, they are bloodthirsty, and they do indeed want to participate in war. And they are amplified, of course, now in this situation. And then you have yet another minority, probably a larger one, which is against the war. But they are depressed, they are mostly silent, and don't really understand what to do. So this is more of a situation of a targeted mobilization. When Putin needs those people to get mobilized in order to stage the support for the war, but also to produce some like real mobilization. I mean, after all, he needs people in the trenches. He needs them in the front lines. He needs them to be ready to contribute their money. This is a big like operational problem for him to keep the majority passive, but still have this minority mobilized and to drain enough resources from this situation. It's a challenge, and I don't think it can be actually resolved.
But according to Levada said, the opinion polls, the share of those who are actively in favor of the war is much larger. So you have these, let's say, roughly 15% who are against, and then you have another one maybe that are depressed and in inner immigration. But the overwhelming majority, according to the opinion polls by Levada, are actively in favoring the war. So this picture of the passive society does not fit these opinion polls. So how do you explain that? Is it basically because there is a bias in the polls, or because people don't dare to answer honestly? So on what grounds do you come to the conclusion that those that are, according to Levada, in a minority are actually the majority?
Oh no, I'm not saying that. Once again, I'm saying that there is a passive majority which is strange, and then there are two groups which are in the minority, and they are both pro-war and anti-war. So speaking of those opinion polls, I mean, I could speak hours about that, but let me give you just one instance that probably will clarify everything. Just a couple of weeks ago, a Russian pollster called Russian Field whom I really recommend to everyone, because they are doing a very important thing. They are publishing their response rates, which Levada would never do. And Russian field are quite honest about their response rates, and their response rates are in single digits, 5 to 7%. So what they did, they asked their sample. They asked them two questions. Question one: let's suppose Vladimir Putin tomorrow ends this war. Would you support him? And 75% said yes. And second question: let's suppose Vladimir Putin tomorrow launches a new assault on Kiev. Would you support him? And 60% said yes. So basically, you have the majority of people who are openly telling you that we would support whatever he does. If he flies us on the moon, that's fine. We support that. Doesn't matter what he does. So the problem with interpreting these data is that we assume that people do have like real fixed preferences about the questions we're asking them. I mean, how on earth you are supposed not to have a preference about such an important thing as war? But that is possible, because people are completely estranged from that. Let them do whatever they want to do. We outsource that forever. If there are Nazis in Ukraine, that's fine. Let's fight Nazis. If there are Nazis in Sakhalin, probably we have to fight Nazis in Sakhalin. That would change nothing. And that, I mean, we have to keep in mind the meaning of these answers when we deal with those numbers.
I want just to admit, that I was talking with some people on this, exactly on this question, with people who obviously against war, with people who were signing petitions, with people who more or less active were protesting, more or less, this is silent protest or something like this. But then I was asking, if someone will call you and would ask you, are you actually supporting this war? What will your answer? And there was very long silence, and most of these people said, on the phone, I think I would answer yes, I support. Because I have my family at home, they know my phone now. This is a fear, this is a heavy fear, I will probably I will answer yes. And this is people who actively did something, against this war. This is also, this is very traumatizing situation when you once saw policemen beating people on the street, when you were beating by yourself, when you are thinking about your family, when you know personally these facts, what happened with people who are openly protesting against the war, this fear growing and growing I'm worrying for myself, I am worrying for my kids, how we will survive. We have no money to leave the country. We have no any possibility to live somewhere else. We don't know language. We have no really any sources, any instruments to jump out from this situation. We have to stay. And in this case, I would better say yes on the phone, just to keep myself more or less sure in this situation. And about these people who writing said, on their cast and something like this is also a position of fear. I will be better with the power that maybe will protect me from this evil what is going on around, then I will be against this power. This is also very difficult.
All this sums up to the picture that we have, maybe the wrong title in our conversation here. So it's not about populism, it's about opportunism. It's about the costs of, protests and the costs of acquiescence. And as long as the cost of protest and of exiting the system are too high, you pay lip service to loyalty, but it's not a popular thing, or at least that's what Gregory says, and you basically also say. So people weigh the cost and the benefits, and they say, the cost of protest of leaving the system or so are far too high for my family and so on. But what does this imply for Putin? So if we have, on the one hand, a charismatic leader, if the charismatic leader is gone, people will be gone too. So there is nothing left. So basically, even if you project everything on a charismatic leader, and the charismatic leader is gone, then the whole thing would be gone, because there would be no reason to be opportunistic anymore, or they would follow the next leader. But basically, it's also not then about Putinism. It's about basically, how do I behave under conditions of what Gregory said in the beginning, insecurity, distrust, and so on. So I will adjust to the next one. But it is then also not a popular support for Putin, because if the next one would say, we have to replace Putin, then they would adjust to that situation too.
Yeah. Yeah, this is I think that this can be like that, yeah, and this is interesting that maybe in this case, in such autocratic authoritarian regime, populism can help to fight it. Mm-hmm. In this case, populistic ideas can involve people in this actually, because they are no any instrument. What Navalny was using, he was using actually anyway populistic ideas, yeah, just to involve people in this protest, in this war with the government, yeah, it's somehow peaceful war, yeah, with the demonstrations. But maybe this would be a possibility to fight. This is very difficult with such totally damaged, atomized society to do something without starting, if not to start from the very beginning, to involve people in active doings, very small but active doings, in the yard to organize something, then in the city something, then in the district or something like this, because people totally unable to not even to fight, but to insist on their basic rights. Basic rights now is hurted, yeah, and people not ready to insist that their basic rights to live, even, yeah, and for justice, for example, yeah, they have to be protected. And this is awful, yeah.
I want to go back a little bit to an issue we touched upon 5 minutes ago, and I'd like to ask this question to Ulrich Schmidt. You both, Irina and Gregory, basically declined my frustration about the West hypothesis. But on the other hand, you, Ulrich, have written a lot about different conceptions of Europe, and also different expectations towards Europe in Russian history, Russian literature, Russian philosophy, and so on. And my question is, this whole return to Europe rhetoric was never projected on Russia. And would you say that we nonetheless also co-produced some estrangement, especially between let's say Russian elites? I mean, the economic elites, that they were always global, but the political elites, but also the others who you say only 8% travel to the West, but we didn't provide them visas. We didn't allow them to travel. We had high barriers. We didn't invite them. We didn't say, come study, or so. Some stipends, yes, Germany, but many others, we were not too invitive. Basically said, when Yeltsin in 1993 went to Warsaw and said, I can also imagine, becoming member of NATO, everybody was scared to death in Brussels. And if he would have said, I want to become member of the EU, everybody would have said, common European house, yes, but not with you. Yeah, you are far too large for us. So would you say in the end, we have nonetheless also contributed to this estrangement, because all those trends that you are very well aware of, far better than I, they were disappointed. And I recall the speech by Kozyrev in 1993, where he basically said, this is going to happen. Be aware of this potential of this backlash. And Kozyrev spoke to a Western audience in 1993, basically saying Putin is in the coming, and be aware what's out there and behave accordingly.
Well, I would say, of course, you're right. This narrative of Russia's return to Europe has never been prominent in Russia, as opposed to East Central Europe. But on the other hand, I also think the Russian elites made choices that basically led towards this estrangement. So after Yeltsin, there were basically only two crown princes, Boris Nemtsov and Putin. And the elites went deliberately for Putin because they were afraid that, well, Nemtsov would westernize the country too much, that basically the country would lose its own identity. They were afraid of too many direct foreign investments. And so Putin was the man, and Putin delivered. After February 24th, I reread his famous speech in the Deutsche Bundestag from 2001. And by now, we know that the Dove passages from that speech were written by Horst Teltschik. And that basically the general topic of that speech was not about, well, let's create a common house of Europe. Of course, famously he said that there, but at the same time, the obsession with NATO is already there. And in a way, I think it is probably more correct to describe the last 20 years as a process of radicalization. And in a way also, well, the most famous and maybe even notorious theory of culture contributed to that. Of course, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Culture, which was very attentively read in the Moscow elite, especially in the conservative elite. And Samuel Huntington meant to describe these several civilizations. And in Moscow, they rather considered this to be a tool for future political actions, that yes, there are different civilizations, and yes, we are our own special, unique civilization, and yes, let them clash.
I would encourage the audience to raise questions in the chat. We had only one, but I would like to open up our discussion here also to those who are out there in the virtual space. And I've only seen as of now one question, which I already here raised to our participants, but I would encourage as much as possible further questioning from the audience. Not waiting for the question, but being maybe an icebreaker. To what extent is the estrangement from the West also a result of certain flaws of the transition to a post-socialist system? I was once in Bishkek, I think last time 10 years ago, and first time 20 years ago. And I recall when I first was in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan, somebody said, you know, is this already democracy or is it still getting worse? So basically, in the name of democracy, people lost their social security. There were no trade unions. There were no strong parties. It was transition from above. It was insider privatization. It was the loss of all those securities. And we felt, you know, freedom and democracy and maybe rule of law is enough. But people basically had other concerns than, you know, the preambula of our constitutions. They had to fight for their everyday survival. And the transition undermined social cohesion because the social fabric was, as a result of the hardships of the 1990s, distorted. And we somehow addressed the whole transformation as something where democracy is one game, and maybe it should be the only game in town, but there was another game, and that game was between economic actors, and one group of actors was empowered and the others failed, disempowered. So to what extent is, you know, the loss of sex appeal of democracy a result of this disconnect between, you know, introducing new values and new institutions, and on the other hand, you know, sacrificing social cohesion?
Well, I'm speaking to you as a Swiss citizen, the home of the first populist party, which is still the strongest party in the Swiss political system. They gather 25 to 30% of our vote. And my interpretation is that, well, the appearance of populism is not an East-West thing. I think we should rather explain this with other factors, with well, with the unease that people experience with modernism, with postmodernism. So in this respect, I would say that the appearance of populism, with its very simple recipes for success with the voters, such as, well, as you said, Andreas, the promise of future social cohesion. Migration is, of course, always a big topic in populist movements. And here we can again see that populist movements, well, know little about right and left wing difference, because for instance, migration can be deterred from a right-wing perspective if you want to protect the nation, and from a left-wing perspective if you want to protect the working class, and in the end it amounts to the same. And I think it was Irina who mentioned earlier that, well, there are also people who are not usually in the camp of populism, such as, for instance, the radical democratic leftist thinker Chantal Mouffe. And she also famously called for a leftist populism. We need to fill a populist movement with the content we like, and we don't have to, well, just leave this successful format of political action to the populists who are really employing it right now.
I mean, there are common traits between, you know, East and West populism, and some speak also of Northern European populism and Southern European populism, and began to do a mapping of populist movements. But there are certain things that are nonetheless popular among the populists in former socialist countries, and that's the issue of social policy. So they take up the leftist agenda, which is also taken up, let's say, in Greece and Southern Europe, partially also in Italy, against corruption of the democratic elites, so the crony capitalism, which is criticized, and also the cronies who were winning after transition, insider privatization, all that is criticized. Then also educational policy as a particular issue. Then, of course, sovereignty, which is also often an issue in countries like Switzerland and so on. But that's popular also there. But the question is, you know, for me, to what extent we have to explain the populism, or let's say the popularity of certain slogans, also as a result of a transition where we had no checks and balances. So the transition started without a vivid civil society. We had a liberal agenda which was originally introduced by Thatcher, Reaganomics, Thatcherism, 1980s, but you couldn't push it through, or it was a deep infight. It was deeply divisive, even in Britain, and Reaganomics was also divisive in the United States. But you had trade unions, you had, opposition parties, you had civil society. All that was absent in the post-socialist countries. So you could push through basically a Reaganomics agenda or Thatcherism in Eastern Europe without any societal checks and balances. To what extent do we thus have to explain the Eastern populism also as something that has to be explained on the backdrop of the absence of any social democratic party or meaningful social democratic parties, of the absence of trade unions, of the absence of powerful, welfare organizations, and so on?
I have 2 points here. One is that what you're suggesting is exactly how I see this transition. It was not a failed transition. It was an extremely successful transition. Exactly what these people who ruled the transition, exactly what they wanted to achieve, they achieved that. What was the agenda? The market reforms. Perfect. We get an absolutely unbridled competition, completely marketized conscience. Everybody sees each other as a wolf in the forest, and there is the entrenched understanding that the communication between the people is the communication not only of competition but of brutal rivalry, a cutthroat competition. This is actually where this nihilist drive to destroy the neighboring people comes from, because the idea of the war is natural. I mean, of course, people kill each other. That's absolutely natural. Then you have next element of that. So what do you have else to export to Russia? Well, elections. Perfect. We have a country which is obsessed with elections. We have the most advanced technologically electoral system in the world. That would be the global leader in electronic voting very soon. A lot of very sophisticated polling techniques are used. We constantly have those poll numbers, which you mentioned, and Russia is, believe me, one of the most advanced countries on that account. So this is a very specific vision of what was supposed to be pushed through, and I agree with you that all those things, those neoliberal reforms, they succeeded precisely because there were no checks, because there were no natural communities to resist them, because there were no options to stop them, to keep them restrained. So that was kind of inevitable in this situation. Russians are actually very good learners. When they start learning something, they learn it right to the end. I think Chadaev in mid-19th century said that we kind of learn to do things in order to teach the others what shouldn't be done, and that is exactly what is happening now. So this is the neoliberalism brought to its extremes. My second short point would be that, of course, I would resist calling it populism. There's nothing populist here. I mean, if we think of textbook cases of populism coming from Latin America, those are leaders who are mobilizing the people, who are close to the people. Look at Chavez or Correa, all of them, I mean, they are always surrounded by the people. Putin is always at 30 meters long table from you. So that's a very different view of power. What kind of view of power is that? Well, I call it, let me introduce this idea. I call it a plebiscitary power. You can call it also Caesarist or Bonapartist power. It is all those are terms from political theory. You have a strong leader who towers above the political system. pretending to rely on the support of the people, and the people is completely passive, only to show up every 4 years at the polling stations to show the acclamation. Otherwise, the people is not needed. But this is a very different logic. It is an opposite logic to populism. I think we do need some populism, and Navalny was trying to embody that. We do need some populism in this system, because we need a democratic resistance within this system. Of course, it is not possible at that point, but probably it will be possible when this system falls.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are probably different forms and versions of populism. The charismatic leader type that you had in Latin America with its presidential systems and delegative democracy and all these kind of terms that were used in the Latin American case. But what I try to understand is, to what extent is this, devaluation of liberal values also in the West and in the East a result of this, 30+ years victory of a liberal economic paradigm. When Dahrendorf wrote a book, I think in the late 1980s, he wrote about the death of the social democracy. He said, the end of the social democratic century, basically. So this whole idea about, post-World War II social cohesion in Europe, it was seen as coming to an end. And then many social democrats actually were even those who pushed forward with liberal economic agendas that the Christian Democrats could have never pushed through. Take Schröder. Kohl could have never done what Schröder did after 1999 in Germany, or 1998 in Germany. You have the same in Italy, you have the same in France, and all the social democratic or socialist parties died as a result, or were diminished to at least half, even if not to a third of the original electorate, following this agenda. Yeah, and maybe we see now slightly a return, a recovery. But so that I look at this whole period, not just as an Eastern experiences, but there is an interplay between the Western experience and the Eastern experiences. And there's a certain interplay between the two things, the two stories. We have not separate stories, but the stories somehow influenced each other. That is my idea, and to what extent we basically, re-imported certain liberal ideas from Eastern Europe. Where you said, market reform successful, winner takes it all principle, and so on. We re-imported this in the East because we said, that's the way you have to flexibilize the labor market. That's the way you have to to get rid here of too strong trade unions and the agreements they sign. And so basically this whole flexibility that we have on the labor market wouldn't have been possible without Eastern Europe after 1989.
That's true, because Eastern Europe was in many respects a laboratory for those neoliberal experiments. I mean, not only Eastern Europe, definitely, but once again, it was a pure laboratory because the resistance was very low. And that was also one of the reasons why Putin wasn't and keeps being so successful among the big business people, because they don't understand what's wrong. I mean, while the guy wages a war, so what's really wrong about that? I mean, no, we've been waging wars as well, and that's why he still has a lot of appeal with the big business. So the situation in Eastern Europe and in countries like Russia, for instance, was even worse than in Western Europe, because the left got completely discredited after the fall of the socialist bloc. And for instance, in Russia, I mean, you have a whole lot of right-wing parties and movements headed by the extreme right-wing Communist Party, and you basically have no left, which could have been a check on that. So in that sense, I do think there is this mutual reinforcement. The ideas that were born in the West, they are later exported to South America, to the East, and then they come back with those very successful people who learn the lesson and start spoiling the West. And now I don't know who is worse off at this point.
Well, maybe we also have to be careful about certain homonymies here, because my impression is that in the West, liberalism was always closely associated, if not identified, with capitalism. And in Russia, everybody saw, or the leading elites said, well, capitalism is fine, liberalism is not. And so I think if we look at the public discourse in Russia, the one that is dominated by the conservative elites, then the main point about Western liberalism is the following. They say, well, in the Russian history, we had two epochs when we experienced Western liberalism. These were the 5 months between the February Revolution and the October Revolution, and then the 90s under Yeltsin. Both experiences were catastrophic. And now I think this is probably the common denominator of this empty ideology, as Irina pointed out, is that it's deeply anti-liberal. So liberalism is the main enemy, and I think this is probably the consensus in the conservative elites in Russia.
Yeah, but that's also ambiguous, Ulrich, and that's interesting because on the one hand, you're right. But on the other hand, people like Putin and ideologists around him, they present themselves as defenders of true liberalism, which is, of course, the right-wing liberalism, the good old Europe, the conservative liberalism, the Burkean liberalism, which is spoiled by the leftists in Europe, and they themselves perceive themselves as being the strongholds of this liberalism. So they are kind of in this view they are saving Europe, and I think it is useful to distinguish between these two strands of liberalism, because these are indeed two different strands, not only in Russia, but I mean objectively these are two different strands, and the liberalism that infected Russia is a liberalism of a different sort than the one which is portrayed as a straw man in Russia now.
Yeah, but Putin's circle would never use the word liberalism for that. They call it conservatism.
They do.
And I think there is this very nice, expression in Russian, the liberasti. These are the homosexuals that are so tolerant that they even, tolerate everything, which is, as Putin always likes to point out, against nature.
No, I agree with it. But Putin has many times said that he himself is, of course, a liberal, and I mean he's honest in saying that. Just that he understands liberalism in a different way, not in this spoiled homosexual way you're mentioning now, but as a good old conservative liberalism of the free market. In that sense, yes, of course, he's a liberal.
I consulted a couple of times the World Value Survey and other surveys, also opinion polls since the early 1990s. And I asked myself then, is there something to Europe compared to, let's say, other cultures? And what divides us and what do we share? And of course, I asked the question because I wanted to understand whether there are any cultural underpinnings for what we, let's say, call populism or popular autocracy. And in the end, it means we are still living in a common European house, because the Russians are in many respects common Europeans. They are at least different to all other neighboring cultures, to Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. So they share more with the other Europeans than with other different cultures that, let's say, Huntington described. There are two things that are particular about Russia. The one is gender. So obviously that's very divisive. You know, homosexuality, LGBT, that is something where, you know, the Russians are different. And then there's another issue, and it is related to religion. It is not that the people are actually religious, so they believe in orthodoxy but don't go to church. And, it's more a denominator. But when you ask, would you marry somebody outside your own religious group, they would not say, you know, I'm open to that. And in that sense, they are similar to Muslim people who are also overwhelmingly answer, I would not marry a non-Muslim. There's also a certain gender divide, so men would never ever marry a non-Muslim woman. Muslim women are more eager somehow or more open to marry. But having said that, I'm asking myself, are these two things, gender and intermarriage, the only dividers? And do we nonetheless, when you look at the longue durée, at the deeper patterns, not opinion polls reacting to, are you in favor of war or not, but at deeper, you know, behavioral patterns, do we nonetheless belong to the same culture? And would we say, you know, the common European house is not that, because the two issues, gender in Islam, if you would have raised this issue 30, 40 years ago, we would have probably gotten here in Germany the same answers as you get them nowadays in Russia. Ulrich, maybe you have an idea on that.
Well, I think if we look at gender, this really seems to be a new iron curtain when it comes to values. So west of the former historical iron curtain, everybody is in favor of gender tolerance, and east of it, well, the picture is quite different. But on the other hand, I think this is only a question of time, because the first West European country to introduce the marriage for everybody was the Netherlands, and it was 20 years ago, so very recently. And so I think that in fact we have to define, or we have to make a distinction, I think, between the use of the notion of culture in political discourse and between, well, cultural studies that may or may not explain divide between Western and Europe and Eastern Europe. And I always get suspicious if politicians start to talk about culture. For instance, let me take an example from the German political sphere. If conservative politicians in Germany start to talk about Islam, I think it's very often against Turkey and the possible EU membership of Turkey, and then they conjure up, well, an allegedly Christian past of Europe, forgetting about the Ottoman Empire and the presence of Islam in Spain. And at the same time, if we look at the political discourse in Russia, this is one of the points that Putin has been using repeatedly, especially during the migration crisis in Europe, in Western Europe especially. And he said, look, Western Europeans, you don't know how to handle Islam. We, instead, in Russia, we live peacefully together with our Islamic population in Tatarstan. Now, of course, this is only half of the truth, because if you look at the Northern Caucasus, of course, the picture is extremely different. And there, of course, the there is no successful cultural coexistence between the Russian imperial project and the local cultural Islamic traditions. So my guess is well, that the main difference is, if we talk about religion, it's not about Christianity and Islam, but it's the differences between secularized societies and not secularized societies. And there I see much more commonalities between the Russians, who were forcefully de-religionized, if I can say so, with the atheism in the Soviet culture, and the Western European societies that are also very atheist or secularized for different reasons.
And I want just to add a little bit, according to this gender question, it was much more peacefully and much more freely in zeros, because I was working in great amount. You can imagine, I was living in a very small city where all is visible, yeah, and I was working in an official state newspaper with a homosexual couple. And they were working there without any problems, yeah. And there was such surrounding. There was a lot of homosexual couples who were living together, not privately, openly, without, of course, there was some elder generation was a little bit suspicious, yeah, and there was rumors about this. But this younger generation, yeah, this was totally tolerant. But then it like artificially grow. Grown problem, yeah, because I noticed this changing of this tolerancy even there where it was there was everything peaceful, yeah, and now I am noticing how it's changing, this attitude, people more and more aggressive, people more and more charged with this we are fighting for traditional family, yeah, idea. This is, for me, was also visible changings, and it seems that it's like with this repetition of propaganda, repetition every day, this repetition in TV and radio and newspapers. We have to find, we mustn't lose. This is also a populistic idea to frighten people what we are losing, yeah, that all our country in danger now only because of this gender question, yeah. This was also such increased, dramatized problem, and it was when this constitution was changed. Here was one of the topic, yeah, that was all the time pushed forward, yeah, that we are fighting for traditional family. There was great amount of these videos where was shown awful situation when kid living in a family with two homosexual parents. This is just impossible.
I have a short follow-up on that. I actually think it's a very good point. Because look, indeed, somehow we failed to find a place for Russia in the European project. I think it's a common responsibility. I don't want to blame anyone for that. That's just not a question of the blame game. We have to think ahead of what would be the solution for that, because Russia is, of course, a European country. I mean, that's absolutely clear to everyone who has ever been to Russia. It's a European country. You can see it immediately. A very special country, but Germany is also a special country, for instance. I think actually Irina makes a very good point, because in terms of those religious attitudes and also like deeply conservative attitudes, I would suspect Russia to be more lax actually than countries like Poland, for instance, more naturally liberal. In the sense of, I mean, Russia is more anarchist, and people more often would have a let it be attitude, not because they are fighting for liberal values, but because they don't really care. And this wave of conservative backlash is, I agree, very much artificial. So when we kind of disentangle, like more or less natural Russian proclivities from this kind of regime, we would get, I think, a more, I mean, a more tolerant society, in a very broad sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, let's have maybe a final round of our discussion here. Let me start with an observation. It has maybe to do with the number of gray hairs or the loss of my hair. I've seen already certain ideologies come and go, and therefore I have maybe also a little bit a relaxed attitude to certain things that are popular. I've seen already many things that were popular and then they disappeared. So I even adopt personally the theory, the economic theory of marginal gains to ideologies. So there's a market of ideologies, and you can treat ideologies as you know, as goods on a market. So when they enter a market, there is a certain appeal, and then you have a certain saturation, and then afterwards you have a decline, or the ideology still delivers. So populism has also to deliver. Socialism didn't deliver, and maybe liberalism did not everything deliver that was promised. And then we had, you know, the war against terror, and also didn't deliver. Then we had nationalism. So I a little bit more relaxed look at, you know, these populist tropes, because they have also to deliver. And if they don't deliver, there are marginal gains. Having said that, I'm asking myself about how would I imagine the world 10 years from now? So a world after Putin, a world after the war, a world where maybe certain populist politicians are simply gone because they died or are no longer in power. And if I ask myself, how would I imagine the world 10 years from now? And what would I do then second in order to backcast? So I have an idea how it may look like. And how would I then work towards this end? So casting back from an imagined future. And maybe this is a little bit, you know, like theater for you now. But I would like you to, you know, entertain me and the audience with, you know, picking this idea up. Imagine 10 years from now, and what do you think would be necessary now for a backcasting exercise? You are not prepared to that, but you know, sometimes in TV shows this happens too, that you are, forced to answer questions you had no preparatory script for. Who wants to begin?
I will begin.
Yeah, I thought so.
This is interesting because I was wondering actually too how it will be, how it can develop, yeah, in 10 years or maybe in 20 years, who knows how long it will last. And there was a fantastic example of a country, Slovakia, who met actually right populist already in 2006, yeah, we can say so. And they were carrying this ballast, yeah, long time. They were chewing this populistic kaugummi, chewing gum long, and then it was just it's like a bubble. It's nevertheless disappearing, yeah. But strangely, in Slovakia, where was all actually created fantastic basement for developing of liberal ideas, and there even appeared this coalition, I don't remember now, as Progress of Slovakia, something like this. And there was young, very active people. They even pushed as a president, they are member of this party. Nevertheless, prime minister, again populist. He's again coming from a very strange party, just how to translate, simple people, something like this, or ordinary people. And and immediately this Prime Minister Matovic, he is bringing the country and or government in a crisis. Yeah, in 2021, when this was a scandal with this Sputnik V or 5. Yeah. And this is also interesting. Now we can develop. We can watch now Slovakia, and we can see how it's developing. Yeah, this is now for me. This is a most interesting example. Of course, we have to see about all backgrounds, about surroundings, about history, about culture. For example, this right populism and Poland is totally different from right populism in Hungary, in attitude to Russia, for example. Yeah, this is such like they are building like two paradigms, how it's developing. Yeah, this is like, but it's in what will be in Russia. Maybe the same like in this Slovakia. Yeah, maybe somehow. Russia can overcome this crisis, but it can last really more than 10 years, more than 20 years, more than 30 years, because such disturbed society, such destroyed society, firstly has to be a little bit cured, then has to appear that is not existing some political field, social field, and then maybe something will grow from it, but it's so far away that it's more interesting now to watch such examples in Europe.
Gregory.
Well, I have a dystopian vision for you, of course. I mean, the war we are witnessing now in Ukraine is not just a matter of a single crazy individual taking incredible power in the Kremlin. It is a reflection of a larger crisis that do exist in contemporary world. And if these crises are not cured, this is definitely not the last act of this war. And I know, I mean, in many countries there is this, including Russia, actually, there is this people, I call them the party of 23rd February. They want to get back exactly to February 23rd, because everything was fine to them. This is basically the big business who never understood why the guy had to ruin everything. And these people are dangerous. These people are dangerous because they harbor the completely unrealistic hopes and they don't understand what happened. But if this party wins, and it's still very influential and has a lot of resources, then we probably are bound to have more conflicts in the close future, including the so-called catastrophic scenario when China invades Taiwan, and we have two major wars which are very likely to coalesce in World War III. But I also have a better vision for you. And the better vision is that we finally start addressing, and it has something to do with the topic of the panel. We finally start addressing the challenges that we are facing now collectively, rather than shifting the blame to each other. And one of the greatest, I mean, there are many of them. There are many of them, the inequality challenge, of course, the security challenges, the migration challenge, the climate change challenge, but very importantly, the democracy challenge. Something is not functioning in the current so-called liberal democratic regimes. And what we're seeing now in Russia is not a deviation from these regimes, but rather a radicalization of the problematic tendencies within these regimes. So my hope lies in repairing or maybe reassembling or maybe reinventing democracy because of this war. Many things are to be done. People should be included in political life rather than pushed out from that in the vain hope that some savvy professionals with PhDs and in fashionable suits would do the job. People have to be brought back, and we have to start addressing the issue of the power of capital in politics, of the power of money in politics. We finally have to start going after the money of the rich, and of course Putin's oligarchs are the first on this list, but they're not the last. So that might kind of help to reassemble the societies, reassemble the solidarity, and particularly the solidarity in Europe. This is where my hope lies in. And in that case, in 10 years, we will have a different vision of the future, a shared issues that will be trying to solve collectively, rather than shifting blame and playing this endless blame game.
Ulrich.
Well, democracy for Russia, in my view, is farther away than 10 years. I would rather use Chekhov and say, well, happiness is out there in 200, maybe 300 years, but today we are working for it. And well, recently Garry Kasparov came up with a quite interesting conceptualization. He said, well, Russia now is North Korea, and we have to create a virtual South Korea, which on the one hand takes place in the diaspora, and in the other hand, well, it gives a voice to the speechless majority in Russia who is against this war. Why is democracy so far away? My answer would be that democracy is not a default mode of a society, but it has a lot of preconditions, and the two most important ones are a functioning party system and a functioning public sphere in the sense of Jürgen Habermas. And it really takes a lot of time to build that up. I think we could say that Germany in the 50s, 60s faced similar challenges, and there, of course, it took not decades, but we had not only the Wirtschaftswunder, but we had also the political miracle of the emergence of a German democracy. So if I want to be realistic and not too dark, then I would say that probably we could hope, in the best of the realistic cases, for a scenario that could bear the name either of a late Soviet scenario or a Spanish scenario. So the late Soviet scenario alludes to Gorbachev, who, well, basically was a convinced Leninist. He didn't want to do away with the Soviet Union. He didn't want to do away with socialism. He believed that socialism is a stronger societal system than capitalism. And, well, in the end, everything happened differently. The Spanish system would be the one after Franco's death in 1975. Where basically the successors said, well, we will continue in the fascist ideology of Franco, but then, of course, also Spain had to modernize, and they did it at quite a high price, because they never talked about all the crimes that were committed during the Franco dictatorship. And so my guess is that Putin, well, has become not only in Europe and globally a toxic figure, and I also think that in China they already begin to look well, very skeptically at Putin these days, and I think this sentiment will also grow within the Russian society if no military solution can be presented in reasonable time. So I think my guess is he won't be a candidate for the presidential elections in 2024. But rather someone else will be presented, and this candidate has to fulfill three conditions. It needs to be someone who is loyal to the current system. It needs to be someone who will guarantee the privileges of the elite, and it needs to be someone who is a technocrat, someone who could modernize the country, because I think it's obvious for everyone, even for the party of the 23rd February, as you call it, that this country is in a dead end, and it desperately needs to modernize if it should be preserved as a nation state.
Thanks very much. I fully agree. The retro future of Putin is providing no answers to the 21st century. We may have to focus on that. I also think that Europe's and Russia's chance is in the loss of this war. And the loss of war always stimulated political change in Russia. And I think what Gregory also said, I want to underline this, that we understood in 28 that democracy is not the only game in town, and probably for the West and its cohesion, it's good that democracy is strengthened again, and those who won or showed their power in 2008 and the following years are under political control. I thank you very much. It was a lively discussion. We covered a huge ground. I also thank to the audience, and if you are interested in the other live streams, you can see that in the video description. It will be uploaded by YouTube, and I hope that our discussion has many more followers once it's uploaded or seen on YouTube. Thanks very much. Enjoy the weekend, and hope to meet you on another exchange of opinions.